Let's make this cute little cabled hem hats. This is a newborn size. Any soft number 4, that's otherwise known as worsted weight yarn, is suitable. Aim for a gauge of 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. You'll see me working on my SK150, and on that, stitch size 5 got the gauge. If you'd like to have a written copy of this pattern, it may be found in the baby bundle on my website. Those who already own the baby bundle will be offered a free additional file to download. And those who buy it from now on have access to this pattern as well. I'm knitting the sample with Hirschner's worsted yarn, and I'm doing an experiment. I'm knitting it straight from the skein. I pulled out enough from the center that there didn't feel like there was any restriction on the yarn, and now it's threaded from here straight through the yarn mast. Start with the row counter at 0 and 24 stitches E-wrapped. I should have pulled that slack out of the yarn, but everything's okay. Knit 2 rows. Hang a comb or some claw weights. Place 3 stitches in hold on the side away from the carriage. Hold position is bringing the needles forward, of course, and you need to know what causes them to stay in hold on your machine. On this machine, this lever needs to be to the number 1. It's similar on all Singer Studios, and on all Brothers, it's the NH button should be set to H. Knit across, then place 1 additional needle in hold. We're going to combine short rowing, which we're doing here, with cabling. The cabling occurs every 4 rows, and it occurs on needles 4, 5, 6, and 7 from the right-hand edge of the knitting, the carriage side of the fabric. If you find the cable cross difficult in its tightness, you may drop stitch 3 and stitch 8. That'll create a little extra room, and it's not going to do any harm because we're going to come back and give them a special treatment later. Do keep the needles in work, and we'll continue short rowing now by putting 3 more needles in hold, knit across, 1 more in hold, and knit back. This completes the short rowing pattern. So now we put all the held needles back in work. The cable pattern consists of 4 rows. We knit 4 rows, then we cross a cable. Well, the short rowing pattern consists of 6 rows. 2 rows knitted on all the needles, then we place 3 in hold, knit across 1, place another in hold, knit across again, place 3 more in hold, knit across, 1 more in hold, knit back across. So that's 6 rows. It's really not difficult to keep track. There are 2 ways that I know of both work well. One is to keep your eye on the row counter. Every multiple of 4 work a cable cross. And there are 6 rows of your short rowing pattern. 2 of them are on all needles. Then you can progressively see 3, 4, 7, and 8 needles go into hold on different rows. And this is easily observable. Just count up the whole needles. But also, you can visually see what's going on with the cable quite easily. If you hold the fabric up and only 2 rows have been knitted since the last cable, it almost looks like a little knot. You don't really see any knitting. Whereas when 4 rows have been knitted, you can see some fabric, stockinette fabric, extending above the knot-looking spot, which is where you crossed your cable. We're going to keep doing all of this for a total of 84 rows. 84 is a multiple of 6 as well as a multiple of 4. So it works out fine. We will do our final cable cross after knitting row 84, and we will put our final needles in hold prior to knitting row 84. What's happening here is we're simultaneously creating the hat hem along the cabled edge and a shaped crown. It's still going to be a gathered crown, but we will have so much less fabric to gather than we usually do with a gathered crown. Okay, let's talk for a moment about this method of short rowing. It doesn't require that we do any wrapping, because by placing 3 needles in hold and knitting across, Then an additional one in knitting back, we're creating what's called the automatic wrap, so we won't get any holes in the knitting. Because the hem edge of the fabric is growing much faster than the opposite edge, you need to move your weights up periodically. Since I'm using a long bar weight, I need to move the whole thing up. You might be using a series of claw weights, and you would adjust them as they seemed to pull down the fabric most effectively. As I've been knitting along, you've seen me use two different methods of returning needles from hold to working position as the short rowing requires. One is to push them back to upper working position. All the way out is hold. Regular working position is what you see on the right at this point. But if you push them back to roughly an inch forward of normal working position, that's called upper working position, and that works fine too. Option 2 is to manipulate the lever. Moving it to number 2 will cause the needles to knit back from hold. If you do that, fine. Just remember to put it back to number 1 when you want to short row again. Here's a step I haven't mentioned so far. You may do this every 20 rows, or if you feel up to it, knit half of the hat as I have done. Then drop stitch number 8, counting in from the right-hand edge of the work, and ladder it all the way down to the first knitted row after the cast on. This yarn is a little bit fuzzy, so I have to pull the last few stitches apart manually. Pick up that first true stitch. Now we're going to work tucked purl, and I have other movies specifically on that if you need more help. But basically, we slide the tool behind 2 rungs, skip the first one. It doesn't get anything except moving behind it. Grab the second rung and pull it through. So we're creating a column of purl stitches that are also tuck stitches. Hang the final stitch on the original needle. Here I'm going to end up with a single stitch that hasn't been tucked. The effect of this column of stitches is to really set off the cable so that you can see it in much greater relief than you could if we just left it on the stockinette background. Do the same exact thing to column number 3 from the right-hand edge. Remember, you may do this either every 20 rows or about 42 rows in, and then again at the end of the knitting. The effect will mean that the hem comes off of the machine completely ready to wear. All it needs is a little bit of a lengthwise tug to set the stitches. So back to knitting. Make sure you do hang a weight or whatever weights you're using before beginning, because they're quite a help. Take note of where you are in the design. Happens that I'm ready to cross a cable. Now about these cable crosses. Of the 4 stitches that are involved, lift the right 2 on one tool, the left 2 on another tool. It does not really matter whether you cross right over left or left over right, just that you be consistent. I'm comfortable with right over left, so I pick up the 2 sets, and then I always replace the right 2 on the left 2 needles first. Keeping the stitches as far back on the tools as they will go while you are manipulating them until you have to dump them on the needles can be a big help to prevent dropping stitches accidentally. I have a more detailed video on 2x2 cables, which is what these are called, that I will put a link in the program notes, so if you're cabling for the first time, and this is a good first-time cable project, you can have a little bit more help if you need it. Let's summarize the pattern. Here is the cast on. We E-wrap 24 stitches to cast on. The cabled edge at the right side of the knitting will become the hem of the hat. Stitches number 4 and 5 are crossed with stitches 6 and 7, counting inwards from the edge, every 4 rows, always cross the same direction. After knitting 84 rows, we will knit one final row, which you'll see me do in a moment, and bind off. The cast on and bind off will be sewn together. Actually, I sew just behind them to create the center back seam of the hat. The edge of the knitting opposite the cable, The left edge, in this case, as we knit it, will be gathered to close the hat crown. When the 84 rows are complete, you should have completed a 6-row cycle of short rowing and a 4-row cycle of cabling. Work one final cable cross after row 84. Place all needles in work and knit across to the left. Snip the yarn, leaving at least a 24-inch tail. Finish the tucked purl columns on columns 3 and 8 and bind off all 24 stitches. I'm using the transfer bind off, just doing it with fingertips because I like the control I get going from left to right. You can leave your weights on for part of the bind off, but you will probably need to remove them before you finish, as I did. Thread the yarn tail into a yarn needle and use it to sew the center back seam. Backstitch is the simplest option here, and I prefer to work it right behind the cast on and the bind off. When it's completed, use running stitch along what was the left hand edge of the fabric, the narrow end. Draw it in, secure the yarn tails, and weave them in. Snip them off, and you're done. Hats of this kind are sort of a nice change. Sideways knitting is fun. Having the cable run around your face is fun. And the cable gives a little bit of firmness that tends to make the hat sit comfortably and well on the head.